Okay, hi everybody. So this is by and large a response video and a response video to a specific individual, but I've decided to put it in a video format because I think some of the things under discussion are quite interesting, even if you weren't involved in that particular discussion. Let me give you a little bit of a background to set the scene here. What had happened is I had listened to a hangout that Kevin Logan had hosted with an individual who goes by the name of Amelia Jane on the business of trans rights, trans issues, and the business of concern trolling with respect to trans issues, and I found it quite an interesting hangout, notwithstanding that I had a couple of points that I wanted to make, and I duly left a comment to Amelia Jane, who kindly responded, and we got involved in an exchange. I would have liked at that stage to have made a written response. Unfortunately, I fell ill at that point and I was sort of laid in bed shivering away for a number of days. Didn't feel capable of making that response, but due to the nature of that, the amount of things that I wanted to say in response grew to the point where I thought actually this would be worth outlining in a video. What I want to make clear though, one of the things that Amelia Jane was clear about was that she doesn't like being brigaded and that she only likes to engage with people in good faith. I think that the engagement that I have had with Amelia Jane thus far has been in good faith, and I wish to keep it that way. And whilst I will link the hangout that she had had with Kevin Logan, and I would encourage anybody who watches this to go and listen to the whole hangout, what I don't want people to do is to go there and then start piling in with loads of confrontational comments, because I think that would be unfair and not in the spirit of the engagement. Indeed, the initial comment that I made was actually quite a combative comment. I'll read it out to you now. I said, "This was a proper mighty sword of self-righteousness exchange. Your guest went from highlighting the disreputable tactics of the opposition and why they are all absolute shits for using them, before declaring them the tool to unleash your own righteous fury on the media at the end of the video. Priceless." It was quite a combative start, I think, notwithstanding that Amelia Jane responded in a very reasonable tone, and we progressed in that way. So I would thank Amelia Jane for that. But let me first explain a little bit of background before we start. Amelia Jane is somebody who was on Kevin Logan's hangout to defend transgendered people, but she doesn't describe herself as transgendered. She describes herself as non-gender binary and prefers the pronouns they and them, which I have no problem with. But what I will say is, I suppose you could say I'm giving myself a little bit of a get out here, is that I felt a little bit, even thinking about these things over the past week or so, a little bit playing like that yes or no game, if you've ever played that, where people ask you questions and you're not allowed to use the words yes or no, which is a very difficult thing to do in actual fact, because you're going against decades of giving those as typical answers to the kinds of questions people will ask you within the scope of that game. And obviously much hilarity results when you end up using the word yes or no, despite your best intentions not to do so. I feel a little bit like this with Amelia Jane. I respect her right to identify as non-gender binary and to be referred to as they and them. Notwithstanding that, she presents to me as somebody who, she has what I perceive as a woman's voice, as having a woman's hairdressing over her head, having the kind of strappy top that I would only associate with people who identify as being a woman as wearing. And indeed her two names, Amelia and Jane, are both names that I would associate with people who regard themselves as women and would wish pronouns like she and her to be used. So it is very, very difficult for me to do that, to view her and not to slip back into thinking in terms of she and her. I will try not to do that, but what I wish to say is that if 2 days time I come back to edit this, I realise that I've slipped up at some point, let me make it known now that that is not deliberate right, that's just the way things are going. I will do the best that I can, but I'm living within the confines for 46 years of my life. 99.999% of people who present as Amelia Jane does would wish to be referred to as she and her, and now I'm dealing with somebody who doesn't, and so there is the possibility that I could slip up on that. Okay, so there were three main issues really that we were discussing. One was the business of brigading and the fact that she'd been brigaded and didn't like it, but as I saw it, she was commending that as a tactic for her side to use with regard to the mainstream media to try and harass them and dogpile them into doing what she would like. That was how I saw that. The second was the business of referring to people as normies, and we'll discuss that in due course. And the third was the business of biological sex and transrationalism, and what she described as the major failing as the transrationalists, which didn't, to me, seem to be a major failing. So those are the things that I wanted to discuss. But in terms of doing that, I wanted to go back and rewatch the original Hangout, and duly doing that, there was a couple of other points that I picked up upon that I wanted to talk about. So let me deal with those first, and the first involves Amelia Jane talking about Meghan Murphy and her transphobic bigotry.
She runs this quote-unquote feminist blog, which is just like sheer transphobic bigotry all around. And when she got banned off Twitter, because I mean, I was there to see it happen. So many of these gender critical feminists were kind of like putting Meghan Murphy in their Twitter handles and like Meghan Murphy was right or some sort of shit. So for an amount of time, and still you could see all these TERFs just sort of like making a kind of Meghan Murphy cult worship thing in their Twitter bios and Twitter handles. I mean, honestly, like these are genuine cultists. These people are genuine cultists.
So the reason that I played this clip is because what was unexplored here, again, as it always seems to be unexplored, is where this transphobic bigotry amongst TERFs comes from. And it's kind of frustrating that it always seems to be overlooked even now, because it is quite clear to me, and this is not true of all TERFs, but it is true of the majority of TERFs that I have had the displeasure to deal with, is that it is effectively not cut from fresh cloth, but it is an expression of their hatred of men. It is their misandry that is driving their views towards trans women. Such is their hatred of men that they cannot bear to deal with the idea that some men will be getting away with having been men and are now invading these women's spaces. Why would they be so concerned about that? They're so concerned about that because their hatred of men is so intense. And I obviously cannot hold all of feminism to be responsible for that, because all feminists don't hate men in this way. Of course they don't. But what I have got to say is that the broader church of feminism has for decades given them a free pass on their hatred of men, and now that hatred of men is showing in this other form in terms of a hatred of trans women, i.e. individuals who used to associate as being a man and don't anymore. Now all of a sudden it's a real problem. Now the bigotry is being exposed. How can we possibly deal with these bigots when it was allowed all along? Some of these individuals like Julie Bindel and Jermaine Greer have been trotting out this shit for decades. These are people who are involved in things like political lesbianism and lesbian separatist groups where men were banned. In some cases where when women within those groups had baby boys, they were told you either get rid of your baby or you leave the group, because even a baby boy is too male for us to accept within our group. That is pure and utter hatred, and in many ways it's got a little bit of a free pass, and yet that is the rotten core that is accounting for a lot, I propose, of these views that TERFs have. It is the hatred of men And now they cannot get their heads around. This is somebody that we despise because this is somebody who identifies as a man. This is a male person, and we cannot abide the thought of a male person or somebody who once identified as a man being allowed into women's spaces because men are violent and evil, molesters. They're all forces of malevolence, and we do not want anything to do with them. In some ways, this is a viper that feminism has harboured within its bosom, and now it's coming back to bite it in the arse.
So I start talking to her about how I believe that the more you expand gender and gender identity, and the more weird Tumblr genders there suddenly are, and the more individual boxes people start creating, and the more they're starting to break out of it and making additional labels and whatever, the more confusing and expansive it's going to get for patriarchy. And eventually we're going to end up in a society where everybody does whatever the fuck they want. None of it really matters anymore. If I want to call myself gender neutral, that's fine. If someone else want to call themselves agender, that's fine. Like, nobody gives a fuck. Just respect what people say they are. There is no fucking problem. And patriarchy has no fucking basis for their entire women should bear children, and here are a bunch of gender essentialist reasons why men are better leaders, like, because that all just falls apart.
So I found this part rather amusing, Amelia. I'm sorry if it sounds like I'm scoffing at it, but it seemed like you felt like you're onto something really, really clever here. And that you've got these people, I'm not interested in the talk about patriarchy, but you're effectively people of, let's say, a very traditionalist persuasion who will talk in terms of men and women and say, well, it's women's job to stay at home and have the children, for example. And you've got this cunning little scheme, right? It's about as cunning as one of Baldric's schemes off Blackadder, as far as I could see, because your cunning schemes seem to be, if we can create so many of these gender identities, right, that they'll all just be so confused. Everybody will have a different gender label, and there won't be a specific gender identity that can say that's the gender identity that has to stay at home and have children. And the reason that your plan felt to me on the level of one of Baldric's cunning plans is because effectively when these people are talking about women should stay at home and having children, right, they don't really mean people who identify as women. What they mean, whether they say it or not, is females, people who have a womb and the ability to gestate children and then to lactate afterwards and having the child there sucking away on their milk, etc., 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 while the mother recovers from the whole business of pregnancy and labour. They are the ones that should stay at home and look after children. So just riddle me this. What stops them just stopping using the word woman and starting using the word female, which is probably what they meant to begin with? It just seems like a tiny, tiny little gaping hole in your scheme there, however well-intentioned your scheme may have been.
And she, at a certain point, she stops arguing with me. And all she says is like, I don't understand, because when I listen to what you think about patriarchy and gender and what the world is that you want, that is exactly what radical feminists want. And I was like, yeah, but I'm not a transphobic shit in the process.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so this is the last bit that I want to play before moving on to the substantive disagreements that we were having in comments. But I just wanted to make the point, what Amelia Jane was talking about here. She was in conversation with a TERF and she just couldn't understand. She's saying when it actually came down to discussing all these different things, we actually seemed to have a lot of common ground. And so I couldn't understand why we have such a different position. As she says here, why is this woman such a transphobic bigot. And I've got to bring you back to what I said a few minutes ago. The difference is because you do not have a fundamental hatred of men as a group. What you're seeing in terms of her transphobic bigotry is effectively just a reflection of her hatred of men, which maybe has got a bit of a free pass from you over the years, and it's only now that suddenly you've started to give a shit about it. But it is that hatred of men that is actually differentiating your perspective than hers, because that is why she's so concerned with trans women being in cis women's spaces, because trans women at the very least at one point were identified by society as men and are male, and she has a hatred of the male of the species and a hatred of people who identify as men, and that is why she will not be able to abide trans women, because they have this link to this group that she has such a tremendous bigotry against. Okay, I just wanted to clear that up because it's amazing how that just seems to go unnoticed. It's kind of frustrating that that seems to go unnoticed. Now, one of the things that we got into a discussion about was this business of trans rationalists. I will play you in a minute what Amelia Jane had to say with regard to this, but this was what I said in one of my comments. However, notwithstanding all of that, your summary of trans rationalists was that they differentiate biological sex from gender and adopt the position that you cannot change your biological sex. I don't know how you can take issue with that fact that applies to all primate species, not just humans, yet boldly declare not just that you know all the facts and somehow also have sufficient warrant to make objective sounding statements to that effect. This was what Amelia Jane said in response. The first thing that they said was facts as in not fear-mongering about detransition rates, which in reality are extremely low and most often the result of other factors than not being trans. Not platforming baseless crap about things like a trans bathroom threat, or people like Graham Linehan who falsely claim children are being medically transed by homophobic parents and organisation, or parroting bunk pseudoscience like rapid onset gender dysphoria. That may well be, but that was not what you said in the hangout. Let me play you what you said on a hangout. You mentioned trans rationalists, and then you gave what you said was what was obviously clearly the defining factor of trans rationalists, and it was nothing whatsoever to do with that. So let me play you what you said, Amelia, with regard to trans rationalists.
What's popping up like mushrooms now is this whole trans rational, like, which are these trans people who agree with TERFs that they will always be the sex that they were born with. Like, they'll always kind of have the gender they were assigned at birth, and they're just transitioning, and it's a mental illness and whatever. But biologically, a trans woman will always be a male and a trans man will always be a female, right? Trans rationalists. And they buy into this bigoted crap. Like, and I can imagine that there are people like that out there, and it's just internalized transphobia.
So that is straight from the horse's mouth what Amelia had to say with regard to these trans rationalists and the beef that she had, the fundamental beef she had with them. And my critic, even though Kevin Logan was like, as you would expect Kevin Logan to be, because he's pig fucking ignorant, oh, that's a terrible thing, what a terrible thing to say. Factually, I could not find anything wrong with the trans rationalists. Now, they might be saying it for all the wrong reasons. There might be more behind it. Some of the things of which Amelia said in that paragraph that I just read you would suggest that. But fundamentally, this was a complaint that she had. And so she said they were not in touch effectively with the facts. And I fundamentally dispute that. What I want to read you out now is the rest of Amelia's response with regard to that. This is what she said. Trans rationalism specifically serves to argue that since, for example, trans women will always be biological males, it's acceptable for others to socially identify and treat trans people according to their biological sex. The whole biological sex binary is in itself a bit of a construct. Sex has never been strictly binary. Bimodal distribution is a far more accurate scientific model. Sex is more complicated than chromosomes and what's between your legs. And the truth of the matter is we don't actually know how much of an innate biological factor there is to being trans. And if there is, trans people aren't exactly biologically the same as their cis counterparts. The only reason people can think that there is because once upon a time we employed such wide bins to shove two binary sexes into that nobody cares about other differences than XY dick, XX vagina. And even then, for trans people who choose to medically transition, their biology effectively changes through hormone therapy and surgery. Okay, so I want to give my response to what Amelia says that. I've got quite a little bit to say with regard to that. I fully accept the point that Amelia says that when a trans person chooses to transition, that the hormones that they take affects them biologically. I don't think anybody could claim that it doesn't. Indeed, there would be no point taking those hormones if it did not affect them biologically. But notwithstanding that, that does not stop biological sex being a binary, because in the vast majority of species on this planet, biological sex is a binary. And it is true. Amelia Jane can stand there and they can say, but biological sex expresses different in different people, and that is absolutely true. And biological sex also expresses differently in different species. That is absolutely true. But that does not stop it being a binary system. That seems to be a misunderstanding of what a binary system entails. I could give you the ultimate binary system, which would be a long string of ones and zeros. I would hope if I did that, we would both be in agreement that that is a binary system by design, by definition. And yet those ones and zeros could all be written in very, very different florid fonts, couldn't they? So all the ones look different to one another and all the zeros look different to one another. But the system is not defined by how those ones and zeros express. The system is defined by the fact that it is a system of ones and zeros. And even if somewhere along that chain we find a character there and we can't even be sure, it is in such an ornate font that we don't even know if it's a 1 or 0, we are still not in the game of being able to say, well, that's it, we've just demonstrated that the binary system itself isn't a binary system. To do that, you would have to go some stage further, and what you would have to do, it would behoove you, it would be incumbent upon you to explain what that third role within the binary system is. The whole business of sexual reproduction is not to give everybody a nice name, to give everybody a nice word above their head, male or female. It is to define the roles within sexual reproduction, and there are two roles within sexual reproduction. Unless you can come up with a third role, it is a binary system, and it doesn't really matter if it expresses differently in different people, just as it doesn't matter that it expresses differently in different species. Indeed, Amelia, you talked yourself about XY chromosomes and penises and XX chromosomes and vaginas. The majority of males on this planet do not have XY chromosomes, right? That is largely the mammalian system. I believe fruit flies have that system and some snakes, and that's pretty much about it. The rest of the males on this planet do not have XY chromosomes. I wouldn't go as far as to say that the majority of males on this planet don't have a penis, though it would not surprise me if that is true. But certainly a substantial number of males on this planet do not have a penis either. They do not have XY chromosomes and they do not have a penis. And yet, we can look at a stag beetle and decipher which one of those stag beetles is male, which one of those stag beetles is female. We can look at anglerfish, that do not have XY chromosomes and do not have a penis, and decipher which one of those anglerfish is male and which one of those is female. We can look at a bird and decipher the same things, despite not having a penis in the case of most birds, and certainly not having XY chromosomes. And the reason is that that is not how we define being male. The XY system is the way in which male bodies are usually constructed in mammals, but let's not confuse the construction technique with the definition. The way that 99% of houses in the UK are constructed is with bricks and mortar. You lay some bricks, you lay a bit of mortar, you lay some more bricks, you lay some more mortar. But that isn't the definition of a house. That is the construction technique by which houses are created. And the XY system is the construction technique by which mammalian bodies in embryological development build male bodies, but it is not the definition of what makes you a male. What makes you a male is having the apparatus to create sperm rather than ova. And that is the definition that extends across the entire animal kingdom without exception. And that is why you can define which stag beetle is the male stag beetle, which anglerfish is the male anglerfish. And indeed, if we were to stumble across, as it turns out, there's only one species of humans around. But if we went back 50,000 years or whatever, and we came across another species, another Homo species, right? If we found that the ones that possessed a penis and had XY chromosomes produced ova, right? Do you think we would still regard them as male? No, we would regard them as female, because it is not a penis or XY chromosomes that define maleness. It is the production of sperm. It is the production of ova, ovum, eggs that defines femaleness. And that is how it works. And there is no third role involved in this. There are only those two roles to be defined, and we use the labels male and female to identify those individuals who perform those roles, who have the apparatus to perform those roles. I don't know why we're trying to make that any more complicated than that, because that is how it is. And I accept that in individuals, right, you can be, maleness can be represented in a slightly different way than in another individual. That has nothing to do with it. That doesn't mean there is a third biological sex. There is still only two roles within the business of sexual reproduction. I don't know why you are trying to fight that fight. Right. You have people on board with the idea that we must separate gender and gender identity from biological sex. Why you then want to revisit those individuals and say, I'm sorry, now we've got to redefine biological sex as well, because unless we do, and that would mean redefining it for the entire of the animal kingdom, right? Not just for humans. We're going to have to do that, because unfortunately, otherwise it might make some people feel uncomfy. I'm afraid the answer that I have to give you is, well, at that point, it's hard shit. Some people are going to have to feel uncomfy. What I want to do is read you the rest of what Amelia had to say with regard to this, because I think that shows you where there is some more common ground, and where I want to suggest that maybe we can get away from some of these issues without going down the whole line of redefining what biological sex entails, or start shaming people for actually being factually correct about what biological sex entails. This is what Amelia had to say. The point is that where trans rights, acceptance and equality are concerned, biology is a pretty irrelevant factor. It's relevant for doctors, not to the person washing their hands at the sink next to you. Trans rationalism is using an irrelevant aspect of how trans people should be treated and socially identified to argue that othering, segregation and misgendering is fine. I hope that clarifies. Amelia, to some extent, that does clarify. And I think there is some common ground with regard to this. There are things that I can certainly get on board with. One of the issues that we have And this is something that I've noted even with governments now, who have seemingly become so much more sophisticated now. They love to lecture us and explain to us how biological sex is different from gender and gender identity, and then they just ignore it as if they don't understand what they are saying themselves and carry on as if the two are the same thing. And I think that is creating a problem. And I'm afraid that some trans activists are part of that problem, because they are happy to see that that confusion between these two things carry on, because they believe that it is in their interests or the interests of trans people. And I think that is wrong-headed. What happens is that we have things, for example, at the moment, whereas if you transition from being a man to a woman and identify as being a woman now, a trans woman, then that is reflected on things such as your passport and your driving license in terms of your biological sex, because what these documents are showing is biological sex rather than gender. So we're still playing this misinformation game here. But I can certainly understand why a trans person would want that reflected on documents like a passport and a driver's license. So what I have suggested is, if it's really, really relevant that we have biological sex on these things, why not have biological sex and gender identity represented on that? So my passport would say male, man. If I decided at some point that I've been living with this kind of dysphoria all my life, and that I've really effectively always regarded myself as a woman, and I decided to transition and I wanted the world to regard me as a woman, right, then that would be reflected upon my passport as saying male, woman. It wouldn't be reflected on my passport as saying fucking female, because then we're going back down the line of suggesting that we understand there's a difference and then pretending that there isn't, and all getting horribly confused again. I have absolutely no problems with doing that on every single piece of documentation other than birth certificate. At the moment, if you transition, for some weird reason, if you transition from being a cis man to a trans woman, that is reflected on your birth certificate as that you are female, even though you're not female, for one thing, and two, your birth certificate is supposed to show your status at the point when you're born, not the status that you are when you're 15 years old or 30 years old or whatever. For example, my father's birth certificate shows him as having been born, ergo being alive. My father died in rather tragic circumstances this time last year. We cannot apply to have that reflected on his birth certificate to say Noel Plum's dad dead, right? Because he wasn't dead at the point he was fucking born. He was alive, very much alive at that point. Your birth certificate should just show you the facts as it was when you were born. It shouldn't reflect something that happens in the future unless you're Doctor Who, for crying out loud. But for everything else, why can't we show both these sets of details? That is the first thing that I would say. The second thing that I would say is that we need to get our arse in gear as a society. This would solve a lot of the issues that you're seeing here, rather than confusing and conflating the binary of sexual reproduction, for which there is only two roles, with our gender expression and identity, which clearly exists within our brains along a spectrum. I absolutely on board with that. Rather than confusing that, let's start deciding which one it is we actually want to be dealing with. So, for example, in the UK, you will find on toilets male and female and man and woman used interchangeably. On changing rooms, you will see male and female and man and woman used interchangeably. Perhaps that's where the problem is. Perhaps on those toilets and changing rooms, if we really what we want is a changing room for people who identify as men and people who identify as women, that's what we should be putting on those things, and not putting male and female. I propose to you that is where we can start to make the difference. But we will never make make that difference whilst ever people like you, I'm afraid, talk with a forked tongue and on the one hand want to differentiate between gender expression and identity and biological sex, but at the same time you're more than happy for these things to be dealt with interchangeably and for changes in gender identity to be reflected on official documents in terms of a change in biological sex. That makes your approach part of the problem as much as it is part of the solution. I hope that clarifies my position on that. So back to what Amelia Jane had to say. That brigading was not in reference to concern trolling tactics as a conscious tactic to spark nationwide controversy and being brigaded by bigots deliberately seeking out trans folks to harass and dunk on isn't really comparable to mass complaining to the media for disingenuous and derogatory covering of trans issues. So let me play you the two chunks that I was comparing with regard to Amelia Jane and this whole business of what I saw as a sort of hypocritical approach to dealing with these issues.
In particular, there's this one person who kept like arguing with me. I made a very like innocent. I'm not on Tumblr almost ever, and I have a very, very tiny Tumblr account. Nobody follows that shit. So I make a post, right? And I say like, can TERFs please stop forcing me to identify with my vagina? That was all I said. And that post got brigaded so badly. That got reblogged by a whole bunch of TERFs. You don't know how many people I had to blog because Jesus Christ. But I have figured out that there is one very important thing that everybody who is at all concerned about trans rights right now should do, and that is force the media to adopt trans-positive points and force the media to actually report on facts. I don't care if you call your newspapers and your news outlets. I don't care if you email them. Just the thing is, we should actually fucking dogpile the media with just bullshit like, fuck you, what you're reporting on isn't accurate, how dare you, I'm gonna cancel my subscription, I'm never watching you again, here is all the correct information. Just bombard them with it. And that is actually pretty much what we need to do. Just a fucking million people all at the same time, just bombarding like, I don't know, The Guardian and the Sunday Times and who the fuck ever writes transphobic articles and be like, we're not taking this anymore. Here's a million fucking emails with the correct information. And if you don't start reporting this shit right now, we're going to flood your inbox.
So I know that in the exchanges that we had on this, Amelia, you tried to differentiate between these two things. And while what you were suggesting was okay, they're concerned trolling and you're not concerned trolling and they're doing it for all the wrong reasons. It really did seem to me like effectively what you were saying is there isn't a bad tactic, there's just a bad target here. Look at the language that you were using. You were talking about forcing the media. You were talking about dogpiling on these organisations. It seems to me that what these TERFs were doing to you was trying to harass you. What they were trying to do was get a sufficient critical mass of people all pushing against you, trying to shut you up, trying to coerce you into not saying what you wanted to say. That's effectively what they're doing. It's a form of harassment. It is a form of dogpiling. That is what they were doing for you. And quite rightly, you objected to it, right? You didn't like it. You said, well, I ended up blocking them all, right? Is this not exactly what you are suggesting doing with the papers? You're using the term dogpiling. You are trying effectively to say what we need to do is, if the media isn't presenting the issues the way that we would like them to, we effectively need to harass and bully the media into doing what we want them to do and doing our bidding for us. If they provide a platform for opinions that we don't like, we should start harassing the media. We should start dogpiling on the media. And what I said and what I was trying to get at in my exchange with you is just have a little bit of a reflection on that and think about that, because effectively it seems to me that what you're endorsing there is the kind of thing that you were taking issue with when it was happening to people such as you. I have no problem. Let me make this crystal clear. I have no problem with you wanting to have your positions reflected in the media as well. But one of the things that you were very clear upon was that you would like people to be better educated with regard to these issues. And I'm on board with that as well. Right, I would like to see people better informed with these things. Unfortunately, being informed, well informed on things, does mean having an appreciation of the arguments that are being made on both sides. Not being told the arguments that the other side make are all fallacious and we're going to do our level best to make sure that you're never exposed to them. We will be the sole purveyors of the facts from now on, right? And we're going to try and make sure that the only facts that you come across are the ones that we are endorsing. That isn't making people well informed. I would suggest on this subject you are well informed, and the reason that I would regard you as well informed isn't particularly because of the stance you take, but because quite clearly you are somebody who is aware of the arguments that are on both sides, the arguments that you hold and also the arguments that the other side holds. That to me is the gold standard of being well informed, and yet it seems to me that on the one hand you want to claim that you would like the population generally to be better informed, but at the same stage you're kind of working against that because you're going to dogpile on the media if they're giving a platform to the people that you regard as your opposition in these matters. And that brings me on to the final point, which was a minor point, but let's still discuss it, and this was this business of labelling people normies, which you did throughout your video.
So I figured there is a reason why quote unquote normies feel this way. And because in general, normies will say like, what's your problem even? Like, so who you really need to get on board is the normies. And how do you get the normies? Concern about the children. When they tell enough people, enough normies will get concerned. And they'll want to talk about it. And that it is designed to get normies into this mindset of, oh my God, something might be wrong. We need to talk about this.
So what had happened as a result of my constantly hearing this term normie throughout the discussion you've had, even though it didn't really seem to fit in with what you was talking about, because what you wanted to express was people who do not have much of an appreciation of the issues, which didn't necessarily seem to fit in with what somebody would describe as a normie anyway, because presumably if you looked at all the different characteristics I would classify as a normie, and yet I do have an appreciation of the issues. Even if I agree with you on some of it and I don't, I at least have an appreciation of the issues. But nevertheless, you wanted to use the term normie, and I felt that you was using that effectively because it was a derogatory term, and this was what I said. I said, I don't know about Belgium, but here in the UK, normies is really a bit of a put down. It is a term you'd usually hear from an adolescent referring to other people, usually older, who just aren't cool or sufficiently enlightened, i.e. see the world the way they do. So this was what I said, and this is what you'd said in response, in defense of your using the word normie. You'd said this: I've only seen normie used in any specific community to indicate the general population, those not familiar with and not directly affected by X. It's frankly by design a term used for majority populations which aren't actually likely to systematically suffer because of words used for them, not even when those words are derogatory. Me calling people who aren't trans and unfamiliar with trans issues normies isn't going to affect the public perception of those people in such a way that they'll have a harder time finding jobs, housing, or at risk of significant violence. Because here's the kicker: normies are the norm, that's why they're called that. They are who society considers normal, non-threatening, socially well-adjusted. They are who largely run shit. Meanwhile, equating trans women with predators, for example, puts them at actual risk. A word or phrase is not necessarily a slur or bad to use just because it hurts someone's feelings. It becomes that through its deliberate use for oppression and its ability to negatively influence public perception of vulnerable demographics who will realistically suffer systematic consequences as a result of the prevalent biases against them. Okay, quite a lot of waffle there in some ways as far as I'm concerned, because really a lot of that wasn't relevant. I wasn't particularly comparing normies to trans people because that wasn't the differentiation you were making. We were comparing these normies, as you call them, to people who are enlightened, who know about these things, whether they're trans or not. So it seems that you've kind of re-engineered the scope of the situation to pit normies against trans people, because then you could make this other little argument. It is clear, I would agree, I accept the point that nobody is going to go out and get beaten up because you've called them a normie, right? I understand that. But let's say we were talking, you've made the differentiation between normies and trans people, for example. So let's just stick with that. Let's say, for example, then we're going to have this conversation and I'm going to call trans people, what would be the opposite of normies? Abnormals. I'm going to call them abnormal, something that I'm sure you would find objectionable and you would pick me up on, right? Because it's a derogatory term. And that's why you would pick me up on it. Now, you could say, well, I'm picking you up on it because it could lead to trans people getting beaten up. Right? Let's say that it didn't. Right? Let's say it didn't. Let's say I could show you, I could look at my crystal ball and show you that me using that term would not lead to a single trans person being beaten up. I propose that you would still find it objectionable because there is no need for me to use a derogatory term. Why would I use a derogatory term there? And in terms of oppression, sure, you can oppress individuals for who they are, but you can also oppress people's positions and people's arguments. That's another form of oppression. And when we're having a discussion and that discussion is all about the arguments, then oppressing the other person's argument through the language that you used is something that I propose that you should try and avoid. I had looked up the word normie. If you look on Wiktionary, for example, it calls it a slang term, usually derogatory. If you look on Know Your Meme, it makes reference to the fact that it is a derogatory term. Okay, so it's not just me saying that it's a derogatory term, and I didn't understand why you felt the need to associate a derogatory term with a group here. Why did you need to do that to make your arguments? That's the point that I was making. It's almost as if you did it because you felt enabled to. You felt like, well, I'm entitled to play by a different set of rules, and I will justify post hoc why I can play at a different set of rules. If you believe that a set of rules are the right set of rules to work by, why not work by those set of rules? Why not try and game the system and game what to me seems to be an argumentational advantage by foul means by using a derogatory term? Sure, it's not going to have the average person beaten up. I accept that. But there's more to it than that. That isn't the only reason we don't use derogatory terms when we're discussing the different sides of an argument. We do it because it prejudices the argument. And if your arguments are good, if they're the right arguments, if they're strong enough, you really shouldn't need to do that, should you? And that was the point that I was trying to make with regard to that. You used the word normies throughout this discussion. There's no going back and redoing that. I'm not suggesting that that should happen, but I would just like to think that perhaps next time you would choose a more neutral. Why not just choose a more neutral term? Why use a derogatory term when there's no reason to be derogatory against these people? Maybe use a more accurate term that better describes the group that you were trying to describe there, rather than a term that didn't even really fit, and it just seemed to be chosen. You wanted to describe the average person, and so from all the different words that you could use to describe the average person, you chose a version that had derogatory connotations, and I couldn't really see a legitimate reason for you to do that. Okay, I think that's pretty much all that I wanted to say in response to Amelia Jane with regard to this. I have very, very much appreciated the positive way in which the exchanges took place, and I think that that has to be the way forwards Right, obviously that isn't always possible. There are people who will be at such loggerheads that you cannot do that. There are people who are bad actors out there. But there are also people out here who would like to find a path through this confusion that is to the betterment of every people, absolutely including trans people, to make their lives more manageable and for them to be able to integrate in society in a much more realistic way. But I think for us to do that, we need to be able to have open discussions with this. Deplatforming people does not help. Creating a chilling effect does not help. And it certainly does not help when you start portraying people as being factually incorrect and abhorrent simply for suggesting that sexual reproduction is a binary system and that the whole business of biological sex is quite different from the business of gender, in that it is reflecting a biological binary arrangement. Okay, interested to know Amelia Jane's thoughts on this, of course, but interested to know everybody else's thoughts as well. Thank you for watching the entirety of this video if you've made it this far, and bye for now.